Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Silent Observer. It started out simple enough, just a few odd notes slipped into my mailbox. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a prank. But each note was stranger than the last. I see you, they'd say. You can't hide from me. There was something about the way the words were written, neatly with a cold, deliberate tone, that sent a chill through my spine. I tried to brush it off. I convinced myself it was some bored teenager with nothing better to do. But the notes didn't stop. Every day, I would come home to find another one waiting for me. Sometimes it was tucked under the mat, sometimes in the mailbox, sometimes just left on the front step, almost as if someone was standing there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to slip it in my view. The messages grew more unsettling with each passing day. I know what you look like when you're sleeping. One read. You walk to the grocery store at 3 p.m. You don't see me, but I see you. At first, I thought it was some kind of sick joke. Maybe someone who lived in the neighborhood was messing with me. I started to lock my door more often, to double check the windows before bed. But it was getting harder to ignore the growing feeling of unease. Then it started to get even worse. I began to see shadows outside my window. At first, it was just a flicker out of the corner of my eye, something I could easily dismiss as my imagination. But it kept happening. Almost every night, around the same time, I'd see it, a dark, shifting figure standing just outside the range of the streetlight, barely visible against the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a neighbor's cat, or just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting. One night, I decided to stay up to see if I could catch a glimpse of whatever or whoever was outside. I sat in the living room, the curtains barely open, peering out into the quiet street. My heart was pounding in my chest as the minutes dragged on, the only sound being the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Then it happened. A figure stepped into view. At first, it was just a silhouette, a dark shape against the inky blackness of the night. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it more clearly. A person standing perfectly still, watching. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew they were looking right at me. The way they stood, unmoving, unnerving, was like something out of a nightmare. I felt my pulse racing, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone. I dialed the police, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. I told them there was someone outside, someone who had been leaving strange notes, someone who was watching me. By the time they arrived, the figure had vanished. I opened the door to them, feeling a mix of relief and fear. I led the officers to where I'd seen the figure, but the street was empty. The only sound was the rustling of the trees in the wind. The officers told me there was nothing they could do, that it was likely someone messing around, maybe a prankster or a bored neighbor. But I knew deep down it wasn't. This wasn't just some prank. This was something far worse. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to convince myself it was over. Maybe it had been a coincidence, a strange but harmless encounter. But when I woke up the next morning, there was another note. I was so close. You should have been more careful. I felt a sickening wave of dread wash over me. The words were calm, too calm. It was like the person knew they had been so close to getting to me, to crossing that line from observation to action. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and fear. The police couldn't trace any of the notes, and they couldn't find any evidence of the figure outside my window. It was as though the person was a ghost, slipping through the cracks without leaving a trace. The feeling of being watched never went away. I kept the blinds drawn, the curtains closed. But even then, I couldn't escape the sensation that someone was there, lurking just out of sight. It wasn't just the shadows at the window anymore. It was everywhere. When I went to the store, when I went for a walk, I felt it like a weight on my chest, a presence I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. One afternoon, I decided to go for a walk. I needed to clear my mind, to take control of the situation, to stop feeling like a prisoner in my own home. But as I walked down the street, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement, a dark shape across the road. My heart skipped a beat. I turned my head, but no one was there. The unsettling feeling intensified. Someone was watching me. I was sure of it. My steps quickened as I hurried home, my head constantly turning, expecting to see that dark figure following me from behind. When I got home, there was a note waiting for me on the front step. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. You can't hide forever. I know where you are. I wanted to scream, to call the police again, but I knew it wouldn't help. It never helped. The person was always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting. In the weeks that followed, I began to feel more and more paranoid. I stopped going out at night altogether. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows set me on edge. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if the person was actually still out there, still watching. And then one day, I received a new note. This time, it was different. It wasn't written on paper, but on something else, a photo. The photo was of me, taken from outside my house, looking out the window. The same window where I had seen the figure standing, staring at me. It was the final straw. I knew now that I couldn't escape. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, the silent observer would always be there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. And the worst part, I couldn't tell if they were real, or if I had become so consumed by fear that I had created them myself. But the feeling of being watched, that never went away. Story 2. The Uninvited Guest. I was working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store, the kind that never really closes, always open for the few late-night wanderers. It wasn't the worst job, but it certainly wasn't the best either. The store was located in a quiet part of town, away from the busy streets, and it had that typical vibe, dim lighting, the hum of the fridge in the back, and the occasional rattle of the vending machines. My shift started at midnight, and I was usually alone for most of it, only interrupted by the odd customer in need of a late-night snack or a drink. It was around 3 a.m. when I first saw him. A man entered the store, looking out of place, yet oddly familiar. His clothes were old and wrinkled, his hair unkempt, as if he hadn't bothered to comb it in days. He had the kind of face you'd forget 5 seconds after looking at it, but something about his smile caught my attention. It wasn't a wide, toothy grin, but more of a tight-lipped kind of smile, polite but just a little too forced. His eyes were tired, but he greeted me with a friendly, "Hey there." I smiled back, a reflex really, as I continued to scan the shelves. He walked over to the coffee machine and filled a cup, making small talk with me as he did. Something fell off, though. I couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at me when I wasn't looking, or the fact that he lingered around longer than usual. He didn't buy much, just a coffee, and then he moved to a small table near the window, sat down, and began sipping slowly, never taking his eyes off me. I tried to ignore it. People came in at odd hours all the time, and I wasn't going to make a big deal out of it. I thought maybe he was just lonely, or maybe I was reading too much into things. But he kept coming back. The next night, I saw him again. It was the same routine, coffee, small talk, and then he sat at the same table staring. This time, however, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying me. I noticed his eyes scanning the store, my face, my movements, like he was committing every detail to memory. I tried to brush it off, but the unease was growing. He started coming in every night like clockwork. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but soon it became clear that this wasn't normal. I began to notice things that I hadn't before. He never really seemed to buy anything else. No snacks, no chips, no cigarettes, just coffee. He'd sit for hours, barely moving, barely blinking. Sometimes, when I wasn't looking, I'd catch him smiling faintly, like he knew something I didn't. But it didn't stop there. A few nights later, I found my first note. It was wedged between 2 cans of soup on the top shelf, something I wouldn't have noticed unless I had been reorganizing. It was written on a scrap of paper, the edges torn, as if it had been ripped off of something bigger. The handwriting was messy, frantic, like someone who was in a hurry or desperate to get something down. It read, "I see you. I know where you live." I froze. My heart pounded. My first thought was that someone was messing with me, but I knew deep down that it wasn't a prank. Whoever had written this knew things about me that they shouldn't have. Things like my address, the kind of car I drove, and that I had a younger sister who occasionally visited me at work. I tossed the note into the trash and tried to brush it off. I couldn't afford to get paranoid. It was just a sick joke, right? Maybe someone had been watching me and had put the note there just to scare me. But it didn't stop. Every night after that, I'd find more notes scattered around the store. Some were hidden between the candy bars. Others slipped under the register. One even in the cooler where we kept the bottled drinks. The messages were always the same. "I see you. I know your every move." And sometimes they get even more specific. "Your car is parked outside. I'll be waiting." I started locking the doors earlier, turning off the lights when the store was empty. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I'd glance up from the counter and see his face pressed against the glass of the door, his eyes wide and unblinking, just staring. If I looked away for even a second, he'd be gone. It was the 3rd week of his visits when I finally found the note that shook me to my core. I had just finished cleaning the back office when I spotted something under the register. It was a folded piece of paper, neatly tucked into the corner where the drawer met the shelf. My heart raced as I pulled it out. It read, "You can't hide from me. I'm always watching." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the first time the note had made me feel truly afraid. There was no question now. This wasn't just some strange person with a fixation on me. This man was stalking me. He knew where I lived. He knew when I was working, and he was watching me when I wasn't looking. I quickly locked the doors and stayed in the back office, trembling. My phone was in my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to dial 911. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but everything about this felt wrong. I had never been so scared in my life. The clock ticked on. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours, and I kept glancing nervously at the store's front windows. I couldn't see anyone out there, but I knew he was close. I knew he was watching me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the cops, told them everything. They assured me they were on their way, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone lurking around. Just the empty store and the lingering sense of dread. They searched the area, but they never found him. He had been watching me from the shadows, and I had never even noticed. I never saw him again. The store became quiet again, and life slowly returned to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me from the distance. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment. And every night, when I lock the doors and turn off the lights, I wonder, just how close is he? Story 3. The phone call. It was a typical Saturday afternoon when I first heard the voice on the other end of the line. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue across the room. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee, trying to relax after a long week. My phone buzzed on the table, breaking the quiet. I glanced at the screen. It was a number I didn't recognize. Curiosity got the best of me, and I picked it up, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. But what I heard wasn't what I expected. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It had a calmness to it that should have been comforting, but it felt wrong, too familiar, as though the person on the other end knew something about me that I hadn't even realized. "I've been following you for a while," the voice said, sending a shiver down my spine. My heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, and I froze, unable to move. I didn't know what to say. I thought I must have misheard. "You look so beautiful when you walk alone in the park," the voice continued. "I watch you every time." I snapped out of my trance, panic rushing in. My mind raced. Who could this be? Why would someone be watching me? I didn't recognize the voice, but the mention of the park, the place where I'd gone for my evening walks for months, felt too personal, too specific. The voice was calm, like it was just telling me something ordinary, but it sent a chill through my entire body. Without thinking, I slammed the phone down, my breath coming fast. I stared at the screen, but the number had already disappeared. My hands shook as I set the phone aside, feeling the weight of the silence in the room. I tried to brush it off as a prank. Maybe it was someone who had just gotten my number and decided to mess with me. I didn't want to let my mind spiral into dark places. But then it happened again the next day. The same number, the same voice, the same unsettling words. "I saw you walk into the coffee shop this morning," the voice said. "I like your scarf. It's my favorite color. You always wear it when you walk through the park." The details were too specific, too accurate. This time, my heart wasn't just racing. It was pounding in my chest like it was trying to escape. I could feel a cold sweat gathering on the back of my neck. I couldn't breathe. My eyes darted around the room as though expecting someone to be standing there, watching me. But no one was there. I wanted to hang up, but I couldn't. My hands were frozen to the phone. "Who is this?" I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. But the person didn't answer. Instead, they simply chuckled softly, a low, almost mocking sound that made my stomach turn. "You'll find out soon enough," the voice said before the call abruptly ended. I sat there for what felt like hours, not sure what to do. The eerie calmness of the call lingered in the air, wrapping itself around me like a heavy blanket. It was hard to shake off, no matter how hard I tried. My mind raced with a million questions. Who would do something like this? And why? The next few days passed in a blur, but the calls didn't stop. Each one was more unsettling than the last. They always started the same way, soft, calm, soothing. But as they continued, I could hear the strange undercurrent of menace creeping in. One day, the voice told me, "I'll be waiting for you by the bench you always sit at in the park. I'll be watching you when you sit there." Just like always, I stared at my phone in horror. The bench, the exact spot in the park where I always sat, under the big oak tree, away from the rest of the crowd. It was my favorite spot. I went there almost every afternoon to read, or just clear my head. How could they know that? How could they know so much about me? My body went cold, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. Someone was watching me. Someone had been following me. That night, I sat in my apartment, too scared to leave. I'd locked all the doors and windows, but it didn't feel like enough. The call had come through again, but this time I didn't pick it up. I couldn't. I was too terrified. My mind was running in every direction. The more I thought about it, the more certain I was that the person wasn't just guessing. They had been following me. They knew exactly where I went, what I did. I started to look over my shoulder every time I went out, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to notice. I didn't go to the park the next day. I couldn't. I was too afraid. The voice had made it clear that they'd be there, and I didn't know what would happen if I showed up. But that didn't make the fear go away. It only made it worse. The not knowing, the waiting, the sense that something was out there, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The calls kept coming, different numbers, different voices, but the same eerie tone, the same unsettling calmness. It was like the person on the other end of the line had all the time in the world. They were patient. They were careful. They were always watching. And then, one evening, after a particularly chilling call, it happened. I was sitting on the couch, trying to calm my racing thoughts when I heard it. A knock at my door. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears as I slowly stood up, my legs weak. I didn't know what to do. I had to check. I had to know if someone was really there. My mind screamed at me to call the police, but my feet wouldn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, sending a jolt of panic through me. I slowly made my way to the door, my heart in my throat. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. My hands shook as I checked the hallway outside, the entire building eerily silent. I was alone. There was no one standing outside my door. But the knock had come from somewhere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was the same person who had been calling me. Whoever they were, they knew where I lived. They knew everything about me. They were close. The calls stopped after that, at least for a while. I don't know what happened to the person on the other end of the line, but I can't help but feel like they're still out there, watching, waiting. Maybe they've moved on to someone else, or maybe they're still keeping an eye on me. Every time I step outside, every time I'm alone in my apartment, I feel their presence lurking in the background. I've learned to live with the fear, but it never goes away. The phone might not ring anymore, but I still wonder, what if they're still watching? What if they're waiting for me to slip up? I don't know the answers, and I don't know if I ever will. But every time my phone buzzes, I hesitate before I pick it up, wondering if I'll hear that voice again.